Okay, cool. Hello everyone. Hello in the room. Hello online. Welcome to our COP debrief. It's a special event and we're really excited. Ash is hopefully going to arrive in the next minute or two. Just before we get started, I just wanted to announce, actually, probably most of you have seen this. We kind of won like the Oscars of higher education. We won an award from the Times Higher Education in outstanding contributions to environmental leadership, and I would have brought the wooden Oscar if Peter had come in and brought it in, but yeah, we don't have it. But yeah, so that's really fantastic. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panel moderator, Dr. Michelle Beeger, who is currently working at Digilab, a data science company locally, and is also starting up at TREX, which is Transition Risk Exeter. That's a startup that's actually spun out from the GSI that Jean-François Mercure and others are part of. So Michelle, take it away.
Cool. Hi, everyone. So I guess my job today is to keep it on time and to kind of just start some conversation. So I will introduce our panelists. So obviously Ash is not here, so we'll try and make do. So we have Mike first here. He works on a global carbon budget and has also done research on understanding the terrestrial carbon cycle. If you want to take it away from there, just tell us a little bit about yourself.
You want me to do slides now?
Yes, and slides as well, yeah.
Okay, I'll move. So hi everyone, yeah, so as just say, I'm part of GCP, so I sit in the maths department. And GCP is basically a massive international organised effort to try and quantify the perturbation in the carbon cycle. So we have, I don't know what it is, 90 organisations, we have over 120 authors. So it's really kind of a massive global effort which we coordinate here in Exeter. So Pierre Friedenstein Maths is the head honcho, and Elisa in the corner there is also one of the bosses, and then kind of myself and Stephen Sitch, I'm going to show in a minute, kind of doing a lot of the work behind the scenes. So we went to COP at the start of November. There's three went to COP, so myself and Stephen presented the science, and Elisa made sure we were in the right place at the right time. We kind of had several events. The kind of main one was this top one here, where we kind of had a press conference where we kind of launched the global carbon budget and kind of the key facts and figures. And then we had various other events as well, where we were speaking about the NDCs. We also had one with the Global South, which was about forest. And then we had an IPCC event, which is kind of a bit technical, but it's all about net zero and land use definitions and how countries aren't actually going to reach net zero, even if they say they are. More about that if we want. And then we had the World Climate Summit as well, where we presented us. So this is just evidence that we definitely went. And there's various pictures of us, kind of the events, the press conference on the left, we had various media interviews on the right-hand side here, and then we put part in various panels as well. So our events were quite well attended. I think there's a lot of noise at COP, and there's a lot of, I would say, a lot of fluff and a lot of nonsense. But people quite like data because it's quite easy. You know, kind of there's no kind of interpretation. It's just kind of this is what the numbers are, and people really like that reality check, which is what we provide. So each year we're kind of getting more and more coverage of GCP. So we published this in the start of the first week of COP, and then this is just looking at how global carbon budget has appeared in the news or on social media. So we have kind of quite a lot of coverage of 1,300 pieces, 300 unique authors in the first couple of weeks. So this is kind of like a big bang at the start before fizzling out, as most of these articles do. And then just because we've got a couple of minutes, I just thought I'd share the kind of major headlines with that. But no surprise in the main results. So here I'm showing emissions from fossil fuel in black and land use change in this grey or this orange bands over the last 60 years. And the red is kind of when you sum them together. So it's total human emissions. The red is kind of, the red dot, sorry, is the projection for 2024. So how do we think things are changing? For fossil fuel, we think increase again, small increase of less than 1%, but it's going to be the highest ever fossil fuel emissions we've ever had. Land use change is hard to see on this scale, but land use change emissions are decreasing, so there is some good news. Reduced deforestation, increased regrowth of forests globally is seeing a decline in land use change emissions. And then overall, total emissions are roughly flat, even though they're kind of increased this year. If you look at the last 10 or so years, we've got plateauing of fossil fuel emissions, of total anthropogenic emissions. But it's really not good enough. And that's the kind of message I went there to COP, was kind of like, yeah, this is great, we're kind of plateauing at emissions, but it's nowhere near what we need. At COP, there was a huge amount of talk about technological solutions, and we now include this in the GCB purely for illustrative purposes because the numbers are tiny. So this is kind of reforestation. It's around 2 gigatons, and you see the tech solutions, and it's around 0.004 megatons. So when you look at the tech solutions for CDRs, sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, they're a million times smaller than fossil fuel emissions. So we include this slide to really get the point across that the technology cannot save us. We can't just keep emitting and suck it all out. It's just not going to happen. So we really need to focus on reducing fossil emissions. And then we update the remaining carbon budget. So if you look at the IPCC, they have this tight correlation between cumulative emissions over time and global temperature rise, basically a linear fit. So we can work out what the remaining carbon budget is, what we're allowed to burn to reach a certain temperature target, and we update that with the latest numbers, and we have 230 gigatons or 6 years left of current emissions. Other estimates think this is as low as 3 years, but either way, it's not a lot of time, and it's slightly more for higher temperature targets. And then just an illustrative pathway of how we can get there. This is, if we wanted to, the green line is if we were going to stay below 1.5 degrees, this is the linear decrease we need. So you can see we're actually at net zero of 2036. So it's not 2050. If we're at zero in 2050, we're going to have a 1.7 degree warming. So this was the kind of key message we went with. Emissions are growing, and we're in a desperate state to get it to reduce. So that's kind of the overall message, and that's all I can say. But happy to talk about anything else in more detail.
Awesome, thank you so much. If we go to our next panelist, Katrina, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, Katrina Ghadiali. A bit of an imposter. I'm from the metal bit, and this was my 4th COP that I've attended. I've been involved in 5 different COPs. But my role at the metal bit is I'm a climate science communicator, which sounds a little bit fluffy. But basically, I work on a lot of the translation of science to make it easier to understand for non-health audiences. I work particularly with central government in the climate departments of DESNA, so energy security, and DEFRA. I was actually seconded into DEFRA for a period of time where I worked directly with their policy teams in developing policy, basically, that was climate related. But I often got asked the questions that you wouldn't expect to be asked, things like, what is precipitation? Can you just explain it to me like I'm really dumb? And they're not dumb at all. I think that's the thing to understand, is that they just don't come from a technical background. Some of them will have scientific understanding, but they don't necessarily have that deep insight that's necessarily needed to really understand the problem. And so I was there to help draw out that relevance, and I still am. I do that from a distance. So in terms of COP, to be honest with you, a lot of the time with COP where I've been involved, I'm basically involved in the logistics and trying to get people in the right place at the right time. I work with the least quite a bit. It's a bit like herding cats at times. I adore cats, but herding them is a nightmare. So it's just, yeah, a lot of the logistics, making sure people are in the right place, looking at strategies, working out what we need to get from COP. From a Met Office perspective, we're often in a very difficult position because we are civil servants. And there's only so many things we're allowed to say in public. Depending on what we'd like to say is not always as easy. And we have to be very mindful of the people that we're working with. We work very closely with the negotiators, and they're often, we have to be mindful of the fact that they're obviously having conversations in rooms that we don't hear, but they will come out and say to us, can you just be careful about how you work, how you talk about that, or how you frame it, because it can have quite a significant impact on the negotiation that they're having. So it's not always as easy as to say, well, it's obvious, why aren't we talking about it? So a lot of the work I do is around that. And then, what else to say really? I don't really have any slides, I'm sorry, I didn't do anything. I could have shown you pictures to prove I was there. I wish I was there. I had cold water showers for like a week, and it's not glamorous. There was no heating. I was on the 16th floor, and the wind blew through the plug sockets and blew stuff off the bedside table. It's not glamorous at all. But it's, yeah, I'm very happy to answer any questions on anything to do with COP and yeah, the feel of it, that kind of thing. But I won't talk too much at this point.
Awesome. Okay, thank you so much. And then finally, Ash, if you want to, is that how you'd like to be referred to?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay. If you want to introduce yourself really quickly.
Well, I'm a visiting research fellow at GSI and have done quite a lot of work with Tim Lenton and Jesse Abrams, specifically around how we quantify climate finance, or how we quantify costs of global warming and what that actually means for the way that we think about climate finance. My background's really from grassroots activism. I was part of the climate justice collective called Wretched of the Earth. So a lot of the way that I think about the climate crisis is around the intersections of racial inequality and climate change, but also the intersections of racial inequality and climate action. A lot of the agenda around decarbonisation can actually replicate some of the imbalances in how resources distributed globally, and actually, as I've kind of and so from that grassroots position, I also ended up leading political strategy for the COP26 Civil Society Coalition, which is kind of really how I started then engaging with Tim and with the kind of climate science community at Exeter. The kind of key thing that we started to notice at COP26 was, I guess for me, that each COP has sort of played out as an increasingly dramatic polarization of global North and global South negotiating teams, to the point that this year, it's been widely reported as the most fractious COP. Yet there is a kind of great distrust of the mechanism that has begun to emerge, which and that's sort of spun in recent years around allegations of greenwashing and dodging deals being organised by COP presidents, in order to use that platform as a kind of staging post for their own economic interests, and actually, directly in opposition to the kind of what's needed to sort of decarbonise the global economy, and that's sort of that's really undermining the kind of the collective effort as we move forward to kind of address climate change, and. Yeah, I guess I'm interested in one at a kind of at a conceptual level. How do we break that impasse? How do we actually start to develop an agenda for political action that actually starts to move both rich countries and poor countries in the same direction? I'm not convinced that that's happening at the moment. I think that's. I guess that's the background.
Yes, yeah, that's perfect. So now comes the hardest part, where I have to pick the first question to ask, because all of you mentioned things that I've set out. So I have to pick the question that most goes with that. We'll do questions for myself for a little bit, and then we'll have questions from the audience. So please also think about questions you want to ask and things you want to hear from our great panelists. So maybe let's go through some of the policy and finance kind of technical details, and then we can talk about the wider picture of COP and how it fits into what we want to achieve. So Mike, you mentioned NDCs. I think maybe not everyone might know what these are. So these stands for nationally determined contributions, is that right? Yes, yeah. And this is part of the Paris Agreement in 2015, part of the requirements set out by that. So I know, I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit. Katrina, if we could pull you in as well, because I know Keir Starmer officially revealed the UK's NDCs, and kind of talk about your reaction to that, and maybe provide a sense of what that means for people. He mentioned, I think the goal was to cut emissions by 81% from the 1990 levels by 2035. So if you guys want to touch on that.
I mean, you'll definitely know more than me about it. I'm just a numbers guy.
this is the most important bit, I think.
Yeah, I mean, so I didn't know much about the NDCs, honestly, before we got invited to do that panel. So then before we went to COP, I decided, okay, well, what is an NDC? So I started just opening some NDCs and reading them.
Yeah.
And they're rubbish. Like, some countries say absolutely nothing in them. So they're the plans, countries' plans to how they're going to decarbonise, right? And different countries are at different stages in that. So the UK's and Europe is like very, very detailed. And then, you know, the global south, or the non-Annex 1 countries is kind of the term. They're really, really bad. So I don't know if that's, yeah. So basically the idea is at one of these sessions, what needs to happen is these Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries like drastically need to increase ambition. So if you look at what the countries say they're going to do, we're going to be at, I think it's nearly 3 degrees warmer.
Okay.
So if you look at what, and this is even with their kind of, we're going to decarbonise, we're going to do this. So we're nowhere near what the Paris Agreement says. We're going to fly past that. So it's not only the implementation gap we talk about. So there's kind of 2 issues. We have the ambition gap. So what the countries say they're going to do is not good enough. And then you look at, okay, so are you even implementing what you're doing? And they're not even doing that.
Yeah.
So there's 2 massive gaps from the NDCs. But yeah, so I think the main thing is that the global north needs to drive, this is driving force here. You know, we're the developed ones, we're the rich ones. We need to have the best ambition, like yes, Thomas one. And then hopefully the global south will follow. So that's kind of my kind of rough take on it. I'm sure you've got much more knowledge and detail than me.
Probably not fair. I mean, I think the important thing to say about the NDCs is they are pledges. Like you said, they're not necessarily, they have to be backed up with action plans. And so you'll see things like the national adaptation plans that come from the UK, and I'm trying to think of all the other names, many reports that get issued. But there's a response coming out, I think, next week from the government on one that was done here. So from our perspective, a greater ambition is always a good thing. It's not, it's never a bad thing to see. It opened COP quite early on, it increased that ambition. So from our perspective, it's a good thing. I agree that they're not always the most ambitious, but there is also a balance sometimes with trying to balance between, our government tends to have a very short life cycle. So they have to think about what's going to keep them in power. So there is definitely a balance there. To keep on doing the good things, you need to be in power. And if you're not in power, then you can't do it. Then we keep having these changes, and that's really not good. So the other thing to point out, I think, from the 81% was a recommendation that was made by the CCC, so the Committee on Climate Change. And every single time the committee has made a recommendation, the UK government have gone with it, and they've been able to achieve it. So that's always really good, because it shows that they're not just making, they could say, oh, we're going to reduce it by 100%, and then they never do it, and they don't get anywhere near, and then that's pointless. So it's good to have those goals in place, and I appreciate that they're not always strong enough, and they're not ambitious enough, but we are actually meeting them every time they're put in. And that was a point that was made by the head of Net Zero for CCC at COP as well. She did say every time they've done it, and every time they've had regions of the UK that have not followed it. So, for example, in Scotland, they made very ambitious pledge, and they didn't keep to it. They didn't even get anywhere near. So it is that reliability. People are always looking for some degree of certainty. If you can see that those targets are set and meet them, then it builds much more momentum within the population to be able to make those changes and put those things in place. So frustrating on one hand, but also good in another.
Yeah.
So, standing on the fence there, like a typical
yeah, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, totally. I mean, I think obviously this COP was billed as the finance COP, and that is something that's been, I think it sort of needs to be understood as really closely connected to the NDCs. From early 2021, I've had quite a lot of interaction with the Barbados government, and that Avinash Persod, who is the special advisor to Motley, led on the Bridgetown agenda for climate finance. Actually, his opening gambit when we first started talking, coming out of the back of COP26, was precisely on what he called pledge fatigue. So, in a sense, the NDCs as a political strategy was the thing that came out of Paris. As you say, like even with the pledges that were actually on the table, we would be hurtling towards a kind of a state of extreme global warming. But actually, the thing that kind of made, I guess there was a kind of real concern around 2021, 22, that the fact that we weren't even, the fact that the NDCs would start to have no connection to reality was going to really unpick any kind of political appetite to engage with this agenda at all. And so what the Barbados team started talking about in relation to that was that it's all very well to talk about NDCs and what our commitments are, but unless we actually start working collectively on establishing what the mechanism is, right? We can say we want to decarbonise in this way, but unless financial mechanisms are in place that actually show us the roadmap to start delivering on those NDCs, they become very quickly meaningless. And I think that, I always feel that that's a really important thing to be talking about with a room full of climate scientists, because it's like, actually, those questions around architecture, actually we're really good, the global carbon budget, a report on your stuff almost every year, because it does just give us that really solid benchmark of, where emissions are at and, how where we are on that journey. But actually, when you look at the data that is out there, or it's collated in a way that governments are able to use, I'm not convinced that we do have a kind of governance architecture that actually shows us how we do decarbonisation, what it costs, all the way through, to achieving some sort of net zero, or what the risks are of those. What the risks are of increasing temperatures, how that, I think actually that modelling, which would be a kind of basic blueprint for governance, through the kind of decades that we're about to kind of move into, doesn't really exist. And it means that businesses and governments are making decisions on, small political, they kind of, it's that question of like, what will keep us in power, what won't, without there being a proper debate about what the costs are of not doing this work.
Because some of it is, so the IPCC Working Group 3 does a lot of the modelling for, it's meant to be kind of exploring possible future pathways, and it's not meant to be prescriptive governments, but a lot of governments do use those pathways from the IPCC as prescriptive kind of pathways. So there is some modelling of risk, but you're completely right that these models, so in Working Group 1, it's going to be climate models, the really detailed physical models. In Working Group 3, it's basically economic models. And these economic models do not capture the climate risks to our health, to the economy. That is not goodness is a great point to make. And just quickly on the NDCs, the massive transparency issue. That when you actually look at the NDCs, you'll read something like, we plan to have 81% decline in our emissions compared to 95, blah, blah, blah. But without, the UK is probably one of the best ones, but if other countries do something similar, and there's no outline on which sectors, how they're going to get there, and if you just hide behind this one global number, how can we know, if we're scientists and we want to track your progress, we don't know where you're going to decarbonise from, we don't know how you're going to do it. Like UAE released their NDC, and they now say that they're 1.5 degree aligned.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, how do we know that's true?
Yeah.
There's just no detailed information. There's massive transparency that's going to undermine the whole thing. With exactly what you're saying about, like, we need to be able to track whether the countries are actually doing what they're saying, and we don't even know what their plans are.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to do. I think.
Yeah. Was there am I mistaken in thinking then that the Paris Agreement did not put out a framework for assessing the viability of these NDCs? No.
Yeah, I think there's important to point out with the Paris Agreement is that it was, it's good in many ways, but it didn't give any specifics. And certainly from a scientific perspective, I'm not a scientist here, but you need measurement, like you need barriers in place to actually measure something against. There's two slight problems with this in the sense that, because now we're grappling over what does 1.5 mean? How do we know when we've got to 1.5?
Yeah.
Is it after, do we have to have 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? What is the definition of that? And so we don't know. But then from a very real perspective, if you're on the ground somewhere where you're where you're seeing the effects and the impacts of climate change on a daily basis. You're seeing your villages swept away because sea level is rising, or hundreds of thousands of people are dying in almost extreme events. You don't care where 1.5 is, you're looking at what's actually happening on the ground. I think that is a good point in terms of how the arguments are framed, that 81% sounds all grandeur, and it's great, and it gets someone loads of headlines and media attention, but what does it actually mean? Like, what are they actually doing to get to that point? And there is work that goes on in government to actually get to that point. But in terms of the Paris Agreement, is slightly detrimental in a way because it sets these targets. They're not targets. They're points at which we cross over into a place where the impacts are even worse. It's not to say that before that point the impacts aren't just as bad, especially in certain parts of the world. It's almost like it's 1.5. That's the point at which people in the Western world will suddenly start to see the impacts, and therefore it matters. Like that's insane. It's ridiculous to think of it in that way. So it's helpful in a way that they brought people to the table and got them talking about it, and it brought it more into the public domain. But it has significant issues with it, and if there isn't that definition in there, and there isn't those limits and boundaries, and they're being worked out after, and that's not necessarily a good thing.
Yeah, definitely 1.5 is not the magic number.
Is that true?
Well, look at that green line. Do you think we're going to hit 1.5?
Well, yes, not the magical number in more than ways than one. But
1.5 is a kind of magic number, especially in a room full of Earth system scientists, right? Because we know a lot about what will happen that will start triggering. We know like how we would start to trigger tipping points in the Earth system at 1.5. So it's actually not. I mean, the geopolitics of it is that 1.5 was all since Copenhagen has been a kind of demand of the most vulnerable countries. They're saying, they've always said not that that's the point at which it will register for rich countries, but that's the point at which small island states disappear. Actually, Paris, the commitment of Paris was to 2 degrees, not to 1.5.
It was with the stretch targets 1.5.
And actually, I feel like there's been increased momentum. So in the run-up to COP26, actually, there was a kind of appetite from the UK presidency at that point to just, get rid of 1.5 as something that we were talking about. They were like, we are going to breach it. This is all about building, momentum and hope. And actually, when we breach 1.5, if we've told people that that's the end of the world, then it's going to make it harder for us to engage people around climate action. And actually, one of the things that we kind of were, as civil society, we were kind of a point of interaction between like Global South negotiating teams and the UK Cabinet Office, and we were kind of like 1.5 has that has it's so crucial from a kind of scientific point of view, and and to the kind of broader framework, this justice argument that the climate movement can't afford to relinquish like that as a significant thing to be aiming for. I feel like there's a question of, well, what does it mean? What does 1.5 mean, given that we are likely to breach it? How do we? I think there's been a way in which rhetorically we've spoken of it as this apocalyptic moment in the future, and now it's getting ever closer. But I don't know. I sort of feel like there's quite a lot packed into that framework.
I think there's a massive disconnect. So we had the last GSI seminar where we had, I forget their names, those 2 authors who spoke about this exact point and about overshoot. And the whole point, and the whole point they made was that when scientists talk about, when physical scientists talk about 1.5, we mean the total emissions. When governments talk about 1.5, they just mean end of century. So you can warm as much as you want, and that's the massive disconnect. And that's when the exact point you're making about tipping points, we're just not thinking about at all. So we've got a massive challenge to communicate. The over-reliance on kind of CDR is just a massive blind spot at the moment.
Yes, on that topic. One of the big headlines, like you mentioned, Ash, was this new the new finance targets that were established. So it was agreed that developed countries would quote, take the lead in raising 300 billion a year for developing countries by 2035. Whereas developing countries wanted 1.3 trillion a year, they got the only at least, and also the caveat that the private sector would be expected to contribute to that. And we've also just touched on the fact that CDR, technology can't save us. Do you guys want to comment on can we expect the private sector to step up, or are we, how cynical do we have to be?
I think when we're kind of looking critically at Paris, and the kind of what's happened or hasn't happened since then, I think the kind of crucial thing to understand, I actually think that what happened to Paris was amazing for climate action. It's pushed it forward a lot. Yes, it's allowed space for greenwash and all kinds of ambiguity, but we were starting at a pretty low level, and the climate agenda has moved forward. But I think a critical thing to understand is that it was uncosted, and so climate finance has always remains completely untethered from our collective vision of the decarbonisation that needs to happen. So the kind of $100 billion a year was the figure that was pledged at Copenhagen back in 2009 by rich countries, and that there's the number was always crazily low. Like it's just not what it would cost to decarbonise the global economy. But it was always, and it was also never met, right? So like the NDCs at a climate finance level, we've had this scenario where one, we're not even talking about the right number, and two, even though it's not the right number, we're not even getting close to meeting it. So there's two aspects of that. There's been a huge amount of momentum that got us to this COP with a commitment to do something about that number and find the right number. And the reason that there was then this breakdown, and it was a total breakdown, and it could really cost the end of the COP system, multilateral negotiation, is that the numbers that came out of it, so developing countries are invested in looking at that kind of global framework and saying, well, this is how much it actually costs to do the thing that we need to do, and they're met with by the people that are holding the resources. A lot of the decisions that would need to be made would need to be agreed by countries like the UK, France, the US, at the IMF, at the World Bank. And those numbers are considered to be not in keeping with political realism, right? It's where's that money going to come from? And again, it's where I kind of see that actually, over time, it's been this constituency that has shifted the ground. In 2009, 1.5 degrees was also considered to be unrealistic. By 2017, Paris then got the commitment from the IPCC to actually do, to bring the climate science together on it. And in 2017, we actually had an IPCC report that then forever after changed our sense of what political reality is around decarbonisation and what's a safe level of warming. I think that's I don't think this community has yet done that for climate finance, where we actually start to say, well, what does this cost? And also, can we articulate that in a way that actually enables us to address the costs of not doing that work? When we say 1.3 trillion is unrealistic, do we have the data that actually tells us what happens when we just allow warming to continue to rise because we haven't sufficiently invested in decarbonisation? Right? Actually, weirdly, it sounds really obvious. It sounds really obvious, but actually, the disconnect that we're getting at COP is that the scientific community hasn't sufficiently rallied around that fundamental data that would allow government strategies to be implemented, which means it hasn't then filtered through to government and policymakers, and therefore leaves events like COP untethered.
Do you want to add to that in any way?
Yeah, I'm not a finance guy, but I worry if it's just not really that important. Like, the most important thing is what I was to say. If we look at what emissions are, like basically that's all China, USA, Europe, India, Russia. That's basically global emissions.
Yeah.
That needs to get to zero.
Yeah.
So the climate finance is obviously for the developing world, which needs to happen. But okay, so we finance the world 300 billion, 1 trillion. We need to get that black line to zero, which is what the Western world needs to do, and the global North's responsibility. So it's kind of one of those things where, again, I'm not exactly sure what the 300 billion or the 1 trillion goes towards, but we just hear nothing about reducing fossil fuel emissions. There was zero mention of it at COP.
Yeah.
We had a bit of it last year in Dubai about the energy transition, and there was no mention of it in the final text this year. And okay, it was the finance COP, but really it's just kind of that black line's not going down fast enough.
Yeah.
And that's the main message we're just not talking about.
Yeah.
And that's what pisses me off.
This is one of the controversies during the climate finance sessions, wasn't it? Where developed countries were arguing, can some of this money be spent in our own country if we're decarbonizing ourselves? I think that was one of the big controversies. At least that's what Carbon Brief told me. Cool. I'm gonna open up to questions in just a minute, but can I have, and this is gonna be a difficult question, but can I have from each of you a very quick, what would you like to see change from COPs in the future? Before I cast out the net. Yeah, Katrina, please.
So as an amateur psychologist, I'm doing a master's in psychology at the moment, and my main interest in this came from the fact that I didn't understand why something as big as this, where ultimately we're trying to influence people to change their behaviour, there seems to be an awful lack of behaviourists around that table. They're not really involved in advising into governments. They're not really involved in the negotiations themselves. I mean, to a certain extent, because negotiators do have a certain amount of understanding of human behaviour, because you can't influence something unless you know it. But like the actual experts from behavioural science and decision science are just not present, and or if they are, they're very much the minority. So I would like to see an enormous change to that and have much more of that involved, because the only way you're going to get that line down is if you change human behaviour. And if we don't understand how that human behaviour works, we can't change it. So that's what I'd like to see change.
Awesome. Mike, do you want to?
I would basically get rid of all NGOs.
Okay.
At COP, and not the good NGOs. Basically, it's full with fake NGOs.
Okay.
I spoke to someone from an NGO, and she gave me her card, and it was head of something at Deloitte.
Oh.
I spoke to someone, and basically it's really hard to get passes.
Yeah.
But if you're a party state or a country, you can have what's called party overflow and just hand them out to anyone. I've heard one story. Barclays are doing a lot of financial work with Peru. The Peruvian government gave loads of party overflow passes to bankers from Barclays. So they're all at COP, walking around with their badge, and it says Peru on it.
Yeah.
So we hear those stats that come out saying, oh, fossil fuel executives, 1,400 at COP. That's the ones we know about.
Oh, okay.
There's all the other ones walking around with countries on their badges that we don't know about. So that's the massive thing. When you walk around, it's mad when you walk around. You don't know who's who. You see some activists, you see a few scientists, and then you see people in suits who are just working for big agriculture or fossil fuel companies. And that needs to change massively, because it's just completely corrupted from the inside.
Yeah.
Inside.
Okay.
I'm not too worried about like what COP. I think I think COP. I mean, yeah, it's nauseating to sort of see the kind of corruption, but that's just the corruption of the world. Actually, I always think like, well, it's great that COP's happening, because if it wasn't happening, then like all of these decisions would just be being made, behind closed doors between oil executives, and I mean they are anyway, right? Like, so actually, what COP fundamentally is the multilateral space in which civil society, business, you know, global North governments, and all the global South governments are there, and it gives us a sort of, it just does give us a little bit of a window into how change might happen or what's blocking it. So for me, the change, what I want to see at COP is what I actually want to see from GSI Exeter. You know, I want to see the immense amount of influence and resource and intelligence here drive a gear shift in the collective discourse around governance as a strategy. So, you know, the top-notch, you know, data that you present around carbon emissions is all completely costed, and that we actually just now move into a different era of, you know, data precision about the impact of these decisions and the failure of decisions to get made and the failure of action over time. Because at the moment, we've made progress, but we're still out at sea, and we haven't actually, as you say, made progress on that crucial thing of bringing the emissions down. But we're only going to get there because we've got better information and a better handle on, you know, on the roadmap that will take us there.
Awesome. Any questions in the crowd? Yes.
It's a question mainly for Ash. So after the events of October 7th and the subsequent Israeli invasion of Gaza and genocide, of course, there's been increasing focus on the links between genocide and climate justice, and particularly in this recent COP. Can you perhaps share your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think that you know, what climate breakdown will. I mean, climate breakdown's already happening, right? Like the 2020s, even the COVID pandemic is, you know, we sort of silo all of these bits of news and these different stories, but actually, you know, the Earth, you know, the planet moved from 1 to 1.1, and in that moment, that's, you know, the kind of cumulative impact of deforestation, rising temperatures also moved, you know, led to the kind of movement of zoonotic disease, right? Like, and then that, you know, so what these processes just will continue every year, every decade, while the planet's warming up. And you know, the areas. So the research that Tim and I kind of worked on together, it's kind of it's presented in a paper that was published in Nature Sustainability last year called "Quantifying the Human Cost of Global Warming," where we basically just present the kind of movement in the human climate niche. So as the planet gets hotter and population trends change, the number of people exposed to global warming shifts. It actually shows a global picture of something that has been described by the critical architect A.L. Wiseman as the conflict-like shoreline. That actually, if you look at like that edge of extreme heat, you know, like, so the Sahara Desert's kind of really clear example of it. But you know, Gaza is very much like the kind of the fringe of that. You know, you see that where that pressure on water fundamentally creates so much food scarcity, water scarcity, that's where you then see like forced migration and, you know, conflict resources, conflict wars, conflict over resources. Sorry. So you know, that's what actually global warming is already starting to look like, right? We're already living in a much more volatile world in the 2020s than we were in the 2030s, and that's going, and that underlying like geopolitics is going to put increased pressure on human rights, on, you know, unless we're able to develop the kind of models of investment, of you know, of human rights, of, you know, of justice that actually enable us to kind of, you know, put in place these bulwarks of stability against that geophysical volatility that's kind of going to play through the system.
Any other questions from the crowd? Yes.
Hiya. My question is mainly for Michael. So I guess it kind of ties in a little bit to what we're talking about with the CCC and having maybe more feasible targets so they can be met, and that may be built. but I was just interested in the people that you spoke to. What was the kind of like range of responses you got when you showed how little potential technological CDR technologies have, and whether or not that sort of inspired, like, were they thinking, oh, does that mean an increased ambition, or does it maybe lead them to think, which I worry about, is going for more like drastic interventions, geoengineering, this kind of things, or maybe, you know, head in the sand as usual. So
I'll be careful what I say, because I didn't show potential, right? So that's what we're currently doing. In 50 years, we could have as many tech breakthroughs as we need, and we could solve the problem. It's a very risky game to play if we keep emitting emissions and then relying on this potential technology. So I'm not sure what we're going to do in the future. The honest answer is people didn't know. People don't know a lot of things, and they don't know what emissions are, they don't know what CDR levels are, they don't know what the land does, they don't know what the oceans do. People are really kind of just lacking. Obviously, everyone's knowledgeable about their area, right? So you don't expect everyone to know the global carbon budget. So when people are all kind of sides, everyone seems to be kind of taking the data just at face value and quite well. And I think it's my gut reaction is that people are motivated you're more motivated after seeing it than not. Whether that goes towards the kind of solar radiation and stuff, I have no idea. I don't really hear much of that COP, to be honest. That hasn't, to my knowledge, hasn't broken through yet, but you know, I'm not involved in every conversation.
I think economists at COP.
Probably more than scientists.
Do they interact with the scientists? Like how?
From my understanding, they do. Certainly within UK government, they definitely interact. They're based in the same team. They have evidence teams that are made up of generally economists and traditional physical scientists who come from different backgrounds. More widely across COP, I'm not quite so au fait with that. But there's definitely plenty of economists that are present at COP. A lot.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the work around this has been sort of led by a guy called Nick Stern down at LSE in Grantham and various Ombre. Yeah, I mean, it is full of economists. I think one of the things that Tim and I have kind of have clocked is that there is also a bit of a kind of history around the academic context of like climate change economics, in which the modelling of William Nordhaus, the DICE model, has been has remained influential probably long beyond its time in what that model, as I understand it, I'm sure you will know a lot more about it than me, essentially does is takes a GDP model where there's an assumption of economic growth and then presents a static variable to account for climate change. And so, and as I understand it, most governments and businesses are essentially using that underlying modelling to, they've just got plug and plays on their USBs that they then put, and that gives them the numbers that allow them to forecast the risk of climate change. Now, historically, the DICE model, so it really informed those discussions around climate finance and 1.5 back at Copenhagen in 2009. At that point, the DICE model was literally saying that it would be cheaper to do nothing about global warming than it would be to try to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. That's simply because the technology, the mechanism that they were using to calculate those risks imagined the impacts of climate change to be much, much less than they are. So I think that there's a huge, huge opportunity for some of you, to take what we know about climate breakdown through Earth system science modelling and to develop an economics from there. And I don't believe that. I mean, I think that people like escapes me. I think there's some thinking around it, but actually it's not there. It's not there yet. It's definitely not the dominant paradigm. I think it's a massive opportunity in a kind of fundamental economics of climate change that actually starts with using a system science modelling and then builds from that to ask what is economy, and
Awesome. This leads us, sorry, I know there's still questions, so you can ask them after, I promise. This leads us kind of in our final segue where I wanted to ask, what can everyone in this room do? I don't like to end anything related to climate, whether it's a panel I do or a film or whatever, without asking this question, so that we end on a hopeful note. Especially since I know, Katrina, you did you're working on the psychological research. If you could kind of, what can we do either as scientists or as, citizens? These are macroeconomic, policy decisions. Where's the room for us as people to leave this room in a hopeful way? And I can ask this to everyone as well. So, I mean, you just went a little bit about what we can do as scientists, but the whole panel is welcome to answer this.
This is one I always struggle with. I tend to look at things from very much the negative side of things, which isn't always that helpful. I don't always see the positive in things. In terms of what can be done, it's really hard. So I think one of the bits of work I've been doing is looking at the impacts of mental health or climate change on mental health, but more specifically within the scientific community. So I noticed specifically within the Met Office that it was working in that space takes its toll. And if you see a lack of action or you perceive a lack of action, that it makes it worse, because you think, well, why am I doing it? What's the point in doing it? Nothing's happening. There's no change being made. So why bother? And I think for me, I found it weirdly inspiring, because it's a case of, well, that's insane. Like, you shouldn't use the word insane. I have to be clear, being a psychologist. But if you've made your life's work doing something, it is doing something and it is having an impact. That knowledge is incredibly useful. It's just how to frame it. And I think that's the most important thing about it, is working with others in a multidisciplinary way. The science can do an awful lot, but it needs to be paired with the people who can frame it the right way, with communicators, with behavioural scientists, with economists, with healthcare workers, for example. I mean, framing climate change in healthcare terms, you can generate an enormous amount of change. When people see the impacts it has on them directly, it may sound quickly they move to change. COVID is a prime example. So I think it's looking at what work you have and who you can pair up with to make that have more of a splash and more of an impact. And I don't mean in a sensationalist way. I mean generally in a, how can I make this hit in a way that's going to make something change? And I don't think we can always do that alone. We're much better if we work with other disciplines to do that. So that would be my biggest piece of advice. Pair up, partner up as much as possible.
Thank you. Any other notes?
Well, you mentioned COVID, so I think my gut reaction is it's very difficult to do things on your own, because if you look at that graph again, so that black dip around 2020, that's the impact of COVID, right? So we all stayed at home for months and months and months, and global emissions dropped by 5%. So that's basically nothing, right? So there's so much baked into the system that whatever you do, global emissions aren't going to fall. So that you can take that mindset and just go, oh, well, we're doomed. Or you can say, well, you need to come from governments there, or the power, which means voting for a party which promised action. So that, I voted Green in the last election. Labour, vote for parties which are going to make a difference. Protest. Join activist groups. Be loud. Have conversations with your friends who aren't, clued up on the science or anything. People who care about, people who understand the issues of climate change, but don't actually engage with it on a day-to-day basis. Have conversations with them, remind them of the issues, constantly remind them. It is difficult because I've got friends who aren't interested in this, and I try and kind of badger them and stuff. And then the big one, which I think is behavioural, is, and I think it's quite an easy one. I stopped eating beef. I'm not going to tell anyone to not eat beef, but when you look at the emissions from different food products, beef is just like the worst thing by such a long way, and even like Devon beef. So it's not about transporting from Brazil. So those are the things I do. So more conversations with non-specialists, and then slight behavioural changes, and then vote for the right party.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you've been said. Katrina, I think the point about like multidisciplinarity is kind of like really crucial. Like, I think like we can't change. We're not going to change overnight. Kind of like the structure of academia and the nature of like your careers in science, right? Like it is a very sort of specialised way of working. That's how the funding moves through it all. But actually, like I just like keep thinking about how what is it that you can do that kind of that brings to your work, that brings to your science your whole person, your whole being. Because I guess the kind of limited experience I've had of interacting with the scientific establishment, I'm like it's really like surprised me to the extent to which we've got these huge like funding structures all not answering all of the questions that we need to be answered, at an existential level. And actually, I feel like everyone has it within them. If you just give, as well as doing the work, if you also give yourself the space to actually just keep looking at the world and going, actually, what are the questions that we need to be answering? Like just the constant movement between those two positions will make something new and really powerful.
Thank you. To close us out, something that I think all of you mentioned, working as a team and taking initiative as an everyday citizen. There's an everyday citizen in this room that I greatly admire, Sarah Finch. She has successfully fought in the UK Supreme Court against oil extraction in what was her then local area in Surrey. And this ruling kind of means that the climate impact of burning oil, coal, and gas now must be taken into account in the UK when you decide whether or not to approve a project. And I think, Sarah, you had a few words for us you wanted to.
Yeah, and actually, I just got a very simple answer to your last question about what can everyone in this room do.
Yes.
And I'm going to make a plea for you all to do one thing, and also maybe inject a little bit of optimism, because I think COP process, thank you, that's really interesting and I've learned loads, but I kind of feel a bit overwhelmed. So 30 years nearly in COPs, and this year we have the highest fossil fuel emissions ever. It's not going to get us away from the problem fast enough. But as citizens, I think we have more influence over our governments nationally than we do over a massive multilateral process. And like as Michelle said, I had the incredible luck to win a court case, which means the UK government is now doing a complete rethink of oil and gas permitting. And that is a big deal because there are billions of tons of oil and gas under the North Sea waiting to be exploited. And so the government is now doing 2 consultations. One's live now, and that is about environmental impact assessment of offshore oil and gas fields before they're permitted. So these are the ones that have already been licensed, but they still haven't got their field development plan, so they can't go ahead yet. They're all on hold while the government works out its new process. So that in itself is incredible. And there's a consultation, it's online, the Department of Energy Security Net Zero website running till 8th of January. And it's like, how should the decision makers approach the Scope 3 emissions of oil and gas? So now developers will have to give a quantity of how much oil and gas, how much greenhouse gases will be produced when that oil and gas is eventually burned. How do the decision maker weigh that up against all the other things and decide whether or not to go ahead? So that's what this consultation is about. So GSI is going to do a joint response. So I hope everyone will add their name to it. But even better, if you've got particular knowledge, you could do your own response. The consultation is online, or you can just write something and email it into them rather than go through their rather vague questionnaire. So if you know anything about sort of attributing climate impacts to greenhouse gas emissions, national targets, anything relevant to the question, please send it in before 8th of January. But I recommend do it before Christmas, just because you might forget in the Christmas period. So that consultation is live now, then coming soon, we think probably before the end of the year, it will be open for about 3 months, is on how the government should enact its manifesto commitment not to license any new oil and gas fields. So between those 2 consultations, if we all, everybody who thinks like we do, contribute, they could well result in all the North Sea oil and gas being left in the ground. That is realistic. I think it's the best opportunity we've had in our lifetimes to achieve such a big win. And also, I would say, we've heard about tipping points. So like when the temperature reaches a certain point, suddenly everything gets worse quicker. There are good tipping points too. And I think this could be a good tipping point, which could maybe nudge us a bit nearer to the green line. Let's be hopeful. Because, you know, if the UK as an advanced, developed, oil-producing nation, if we decided to leave our oil and gas in the ground, that could, other countries could copy that. So please, as well as doing all the other brilliant long-term bigger things that they've suggested, have a look at the consultation, Department of Energy and Security Net Zero, or wait for the GSI one and add your name to it, or suggest how it could be better. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Do we have any details on when the GSI joint response is coming out?
We'll send that out.
Can you send the links to
Before next week, I hope. Okay, yeah, and I'll put the link to the consultation. Please do it. If you look at the consultation, your heart will sink because it's got waffly language, but it really is important.
Yeah. Awesome. I mean, we're all academics, we're all great at paperwork, so come on. Great. I want to thank our panel so much. Thank you all for your expertise. It's been amazing hearing about it. I could sit here all day and ask more questions, but I'm aware that we are past time. So yeah, thank you so much. Everyone can be